Can everyone hear me all right? Welcome to Reviewing Economics Education Efficiency or Resilience. I'm Matthew and I'll be facilitating this session. If you have any tech problems, please just send a private text to Ross, who will be under the name Tech Support. So just so everyone's aware, the session is going to be live streamed. The session will begin with an introduction by Earle shortly after I finish laying out the structure for you. He's the co-author of the Economics and currently the chief executive of the Economy. He'll be bringing a broad view of issues in economics education. This will be followed by presentations of economics curriculum researchers by 3 different groups. Sophia from Post-Crash Economic Society in Manchester, Radhika and Peter from Durham Society for Economic Pluralism, and Mads from Rethinking Denmark. This presentation will last for half an hour and will end at 5:40 p.m. Afterwards, there'll be 20 minutes of Q&A directed at those student groups. The academics panel will then begin at 6 p.m. We have the pleasure to have Dr. Guizzo, Dr. Mearman, and Joe for this segment. Dr. Guizzo has an expertise in the history of economic thought, philosophy of economics, and economics education. Some of her works include co-leading a study group on the impacts of the Research Excellence Framework. She is also a founding member of DECon, Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics. Dr. Mearman is an associate professor of economics in Leeds University Business School. He has the responsibility for delivering economics education at Leeds in his role as director of student education for the economics division. They will be responding to the findings and conclusions from the previous segments, drawing from their own research as well. This academics panel will last for 20 minutes, after which there'll be a second round of Q&A lasting 10 minutes. The event will end at 6:30 p.m. And so without further ado, please welcome Joe for introduction. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, everyone from all over the world. It's lovely to be with you in this digital space. And lovely to be here talking about curriculum for 11 years, I think, worked out. Oh, no, not sorry, that's 9 years. I started studying Manchester. Yeah, we were part of setting up Post-Crash Society and Rethinking. And today, I just wanted to kind of give a summary as questions of the kinds of frustrations we felt that you can still feel today. Just so we can wrap everything out. So without further ado, yeah, we were there in 2011. The Eurozone crisis was happening. The financial crisis happened 3 years ago, and none of that was present, as I'm sure many will have experienced. So we started a campaign to try and change it, and at that point we didn't have the language really to talk about any of this. We wrote a report and then later with the Economics, we wrote a report. We did a curriculum review of 7 universities across the UK. And I guess as we developed this language, it became about pluralism, the idea of pluralism, the idea that there were different ways of looking at the economy. You could call these perspectives. So what we were taught, and what we later found as students across the world living what is a kind of perspective called neoclassical economics. I won't kind of go into fully defining it here, just because I want to kind of keep it broad and keep it quick. But some of the aspects of that was a very heavy use of a quite particular kinds of maths, a focus on individual decision makers, and a real focus on optimization and equilibrium. We later, we were discovering that there were all these other perspectives out there that we weren't being taught about. To name just a few, you've got Austrian economics, Marxist economics, complexity economics, behavioral, institutional, And it's kind of like, okay, so there are all of these perspectives. Why does that matter? Why does it really matter? And I think it really goes to the core of what, you know, what you believe economics is about, what you believe the economy is about, what you believe education is about. So, you know, the curriculum reviews we did found that the vast majority of economics education was about learning to use and manipulate models. These were very rarely related to the real world. You were very rarely asked to do any kind of critical thinking. There was one right answer. And you know, this sense that this isn't education. This isn't being taught to really engage with the world, to try to understand it, to try to address the problems that we all very clearly see and feel. This really is an indoctrination into a particular way of thinking. And don't get me wrong, that way of thinking is valuable for lots of things. But it's definitely not the only way of thinking, and it's definitely not valuable for lots of things. Some things it's rubbish at and actively harmful. So, and I guess I've got kind of two quotes here about what it means to be an economist. So you've got Keynes writing in the 30s saying, the master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He should have said he or she must be a mathematician, historian, statesman, and philosopher. You've then got a different view of economics, which is summarized nicely by Gary Becker in the 70s, in which he says, the combined assumptions of maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and market equilibrium used relentlessly and unflinchingly form the heart of the economic approach as I see it. Pluralism and the student movement, I think, is very much about the former, and even going beyond the former, and very much about challenging Becker's view of what being an economist is. I think it goes to the very heart of how we view the world. So Herman Daly, who is an ecological economist, he described the kind of neoclassical approach as leading you to seeing the world as an individualistic world with no limits, where natural resources are just one of many available inputs to production. Wants are endless. Welfare is primarily a function of material consumption, and growth in the size of the economy is the primary objective. In contrast, an ecological approach would say, okay, we're in a world in which the economy is a subsystem of the ecosystem and the social system, and where well-being is determined by a range of factors, only some of which are quantifiable. And so that, these are massively different. And if we're only teaching the next generation of our experts, of our economists, the people we're going to entrust with our economies, the former, then something's very wrong. And I think the world is fundamentally in a much more dangerous place. So yeah, this really goes to the heart of society, to politics, to education. It's about us as the next generation trying to secure for ourselves an education that will hopefully give us the best shot at building a kind of world that we'd be happy and proud to leave to our children and the next generation of economists behind us. I think that might be my time.
Thanks, Joe. So next up, we have Sophia from Post-Crash Open Society from Manchester, Radhika and Peter from Durham Society for Economic Tourism, and Mads from IE Denmark to present their findings and conclusions from the research.
All right, thank you, Joe, for your introduction, and thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I'm going to introduce you to the report that is due to be published very soon. It's an updated report from 2014. We're taking a look at what has changed and what hasn't. It consists of a mixed methods approach to assessing how well economics education performs at the University of Manchester in three main categories: pluralism, critical thinking, and real world application. We chose these three because that is something that we consider to be important in reversing this indoctrination that Joe was speaking about. We have used a comprehensive module review in which we have assessed how well the economics modules in all 3 years are performing against the three criteria. Then we have conducted a student survey in which we have assessed student attitudes towards economics education at the university, as well as their motivation to study economics and their career plans after completing the degree. Lastly, we have assessed the department's perspective on our proposals in two ways: through a survey and through an interview with two department representatives, and these were supposed to clarify their position on our proposed changes in economics education. And it was supposed to give us an overview of the department's opinions on our arguments and demands. So about the module review, it has pretty much confirmed what the committee has anticipated, what a subjective experience of economics education was. So there is an overwhelming lack of pluralism within the module's thought, both first and second year core modules being heavily reliant on neoclassical models. In the third year, the situation improves. However, there are no core modules, so a lot of choices left to the student. However, the modules are still used in neoclassical textbooks with very little insight from other social sciences. Interdisciplinarity and pluralism in methodology and schools of thought generally improve as the course progresses. However, there is still room for improvement. There is still no history of economic thought module, as well as no module in economic philosophy or modules exploring the ethical implications of being an economist, for example. The assessment methods rarely involved essay writing and they're often heavily reliant on multiple choice questions and problem sets, and they do not help with the critical thinking side of our campaign. Similarly, the assigned reading material for most of the modules consist of textbooks, 100% of all core modules in the first year, and very rarely would the students read papers coming from heterodox economists. So it is all very, very neoclassical. There are some exceptions, of course. For example, development economics modules would include some heterodox economist papers. When it comes to the textbooks themselves, the first years are heavily reliant on the core textbook, which, it is a positive development from the last report published in 2014, but it's still not sufficient because the assessments are not relying on the readings from the core textbook, and still it is not exactly what we were pushing for in the 2014 report. The survey was quite limited in scope, but it does confirm that there is demand for what we are proposing. So some of our findings show that 90% of the respondents claim that they would like to see more real world application in their course. Just under 70% agree that they would like to explore the relationship between economics and other social sciences. Similarly, 2/3 of all students surveyed would like to learn about different schools of thought in economics. However, it is important to note that many students are not aware of the role of pluralism in economics education. More than 1/3 of all respondents have indicated that they have actually not identified a significant improvement. Some even saying that they haven't identified a decline in their understanding of heterodoxy in economics. This should not be taken for granted though, given that our module review has shown that the department usually considers a dash of ISLM models and a little bit of Marx as a sufficient addition to the neoclassical orthodoxy. So it is important to realize that the students themselves might not be aware of the range economics has in terms of schools of thought. The conversation with the department was interesting. We have clarified their perspective on our proposals. They do agree that more real world application is necessary. They recognize that they could be doing more to improve on this. Similarly, they agreed that the reintroduction of a history of economic thought module is necessary, as well as the need to avoid repetition across modules in order to make space for alternative perspectives. This is especially needed, yeah, if we were to introduce interdisciplinarity and pluralism. There is a lot of repetition, for example, in terms of oligopoly theory in business economics, as well as in microeconomics modules. However, there is clear disagreement on the need to teach alternative schools of thought. The department is pretty much set on the view that neoclassical economics is not only the only valid approach to the economics, but is also not a monolith and diverse in and of itself. They would argue that there is already enough diversity in economics as a discipline in terms of the neoclassical approach. As we were producing the report, there have been a number of difficulties that we have identified. Firstly, as a group of undergraduate economics students, we have never received training in social science research design. So many methods we had to learn as we go, identifying flaws in our data collection when it was already too late to change our methods. For example, when the committee was evaluating modules they had taken, it was unclear whether we were trying to indicate whether some material has been examined or just taught. Similarly, in producing the student survey, it could have been clearer which schools of thought do we mean when we're asking students to assess their knowledge progression in their areas. So we have been lacking in those areas. In contacting the department, it would be unfair to say that they were unresponsive or uncooperative. The department representatives happily consented to being interviewed, and that did help clarify what the department's view in our proposals is. However, the survey that we sent to the department members has received an overwhelming lack of responses. So we've got only 6 responses out of 50 members of the department. And this has prevented us from having a more precise idea on what the department's view actually is on our proposals. Some might argue that this also indicates apathy or a lack of interest in our cause, but in correspondence with the department representatives, they have argued that actions are more important than responding to a survey when it comes to expressing their support for post-crash. This is of course debatable, but we're willing to give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to that. And that's pretty much all I have to say about our forthcoming report. Thank you for listening.
Radhika.
Hi, everyone. So work on the curriculum reform in Durham has been underway since 2017, and the most comprehensive research document for the reform has been the review of 2017 to 18, which is available on the Durham's Pluralism website. A lot of the themes that emerge from this review are quite similar to some of the things that Sophia has pointed out. But since then, we've been putting together interviews and surveys with both the faculty as well as students on campus to compile the next edition of the review. So I will be presenting the findings as well as some of the themes that emerge from both these sets of research today. I'll start with the most recent things that we've been working on first. A series of one-to-one faculty interviews have been conducted to understand the sort of perspective that teaching staff believes the economics degree should be offering to undergraduates. So approximately 20 or so faculty members have been interviewed so far. A list of 6 broad questions was asked to each of them. And the questions range from things like what is the purpose of an economics degree to how more pluralist perspectives can actually be incorporated into the curriculum. A lot of similar and large-scale problems started emerging from their responses. So Peter is going to be discussing some of the broader societal issues that play into their responses. But the interesting thing that I find is that most academic faculty members or teaching staff are quite keen to go into more pluralist perspectives within their curriculum. At the same time, all of them talk about more management-related problems and administrative problems with actually putting these sorts of perspectives into the curriculum, right? So there seems to be quite a conflict between the research and teaching contracts that teaching staff are actually brought into these universities for. And this is something that has been a theme in our research for reform since 2017. Another thing that they talk about is the lack of student engagement and demand. So they talk about the fact that students themselves don't actually subscribe to more heterodox modules such as post-Keynesian economics or environmental economics, which are some of the modules that are actually offered at Durham. At the same time, there is also a lack of awareness amongst the student body themselves. So students are not actually aware of the fact that these modules are out there for them to take up. And in event of the fact that they are aware, there are a lot of prerequisites and co-requisites that they are not told about. So in case there's no prior planning on the student's part to actually think about, oh, I'm going to take up this module in second year or third year, it's difficult to subscribe to these modules even if they are interested. A third thing that comes up is management reluctance. So even during the time of the 2017 review and during the time of conducting some of the faculty interviews, the reluctance from the administration to engage in any sort of reform for curriculum is something that's become a massive roadblock and very apparent in any sort of conversation with management. So these are some of the issues that have started coming up and things that we're going to work on in the next review. As for the 2017 review, it analyzed economics at Durham in two ways. So first was an econocracy-esque analysis of the exam questions across different modules, and second was a student perception survey. So the report was guided by understanding the purpose of an economics degree as giving students the best possible understanding of economic phenomena, whether that was giving them sort of a historical context or giving them the mathematical tools and abilities. So the core principles that the report followed in this regard were, number one, a real-world approach, which basically means focusing on application-based things, current affairs, and economic history in specific countries. The second one was core skills, such as critical thinking and technical skill, i.e., statistical learning and mathematical tools, which can actually enable you to put some of these theories to use, and perspective, which includes the history of economic thought, philosophy of science, ethics, and interdisciplinarity within economics itself. So some of the key findings we found based on these principles were, number one, there is a severe lack of critical evaluation in our assessment methods. So based on exam papers and formative and summative assignments, not a lot of questions statistically ask you to critically evaluate or engage with any of the material that you've learned. Second was a very large gap in real world analysis in a lot of these things. And third was a lack of awareness on the foundations of economic theory. So for more module-specific results, the data analyzed module handbooks, course descriptions, coursework, summative exams, student registration data, and module descriptions for modules in other departments as well. And the type of skills and thinking that the work that was assigned to all of these students was analyzed. So there were 5 main findings from this module-specific analysis. The first was in terms of non-mainstream modules in the history of economic thought, because the economics department does offer a handful of modules that are outside the mainstream, as well as 2 history of economic thought modules, one that you can take up in the first year and the second that you can take up in the third year. But neither of these is compulsory. And in year 1, only about 60% opted for Het 1, while 15% opted for history of economic thought in the third year, suggesting that the relevance or importance of these modules, even if they are offered, is not emphasized enough for students to actually want to take them up. From other mainstream modules, they do offer post-Keynesian economics, which has a less than 8% subscription, and Heterodox Economics, which has been on the course guide, but still has not been launched since 2016 because of cited staffing issues. The second big problem that emerges is that of interdisciplinarity. So students who study economics have the choice to take up an optional module outside of the economics faculty, like economic geography or philosophy of economics and politics. But again, subscription to a lot of these modules is very low. Like 7.5% of economics students took up philosophy of economics and politics because they're not aware that these modules exist. And like I've said, they require a lot of pre and co-requisites, which make it a lot more difficult for single honors economics students to go out of their way and find and do these modules. The third and one of the most important findings is the lack of an ethics module. Currently, there are no modules that specifically outline the ethical basis and application for many of the economic theories that we learn. In 2015, economic ethics was introduced, but it was scrapped the next year. Optional modules like economics of social policy and public economics skim over some of the ethical considerations, but they emphasize a lot of the technicalities of equity instead of the actual questions of equality that these theories are based on. The philosophy of economics module that's offered by the philosophy department is again very much under advertised. And the reason why something like ethics in economics is so pertinent, especially today, is because I think, especially because of the coronavirus, it has shown that public policy decisions that are related to the economy, they require a lot of trade-offs and difficult decisions to be made. And these trade-offs are definitely characterized by moral judgments and value judgments, right? So even for an economist who has the toolkit that's necessary for him to make these sort of cost-benefit analyses, there always has to be some sort of ideological or morally loaded grounds on which they propose a particular policy. And without actually giving students some sort of ethical understanding of how theories can come into play in the real world, in crises like these, it's very difficult for them to feel like they're equipped to understand as well as act on the things that they've learned. The fourth thing that comes out is the lack of a research methodology module, which is something that even Sophia had brought up. So most of the social science disciplines that we have at Durham, such as politics, history, philosophy, or sociology, have compulsory introductory courses which specialize in research methods of their discipline, how research is conducted, how theories and knowledge are produced, etc. But this is completely absent in economics. The two introductory courses that undergrads have, economic methods and principles of economics, emphasize mathematical skills while going into the context of how the mathematics fits into models, but they don't really go into, the assumptions that are made in the process, the validity of these assumptions, how to actually carry out economic research, limitations of some of the models that you're using, or any sort of philosophy of science. The last thing that comes out is a very real lack of real world application. So while some optional modules like economics of social policy, European economics, and public economics apply theory to empirical reality in both lectures and seminars, maybe by nature of the very, topics that they are focusing on, the only introductory module that utilizes any real world examples and content is world economy. There's a severe lack of applicability in the content of basic and compulsory modules like principles of economics, economic methods, advanced macro, micro, and economic data analysis. So students learn these in isolation of any sort of empirical context to apply them to, which is why when the student perception survey was carried out, almost 95% of the students said that they would be more engaged if there was greater application of models to real world issues. 90% agreed that if there was more of a focus on critical thinking, it would make them more engaged with what they were learning. 88.5% said that they actually have an understanding of mainstream economics, but 50% said that they have no reason as to why they are taught mainstream or why they're not actually taught any of the other heterodox economics. And 80% of them did indicate that they wanted a career later in a field related to economics, which is why all of these lacks and gaps are extremely worrying. So in terms of the research impact of the things that we're carrying out right now, I think it's extremely important to think of these things as, what exactly we're trying to provide in an undergraduate education. It's not simply things that you can find in a textbook. Even in most of the faculty interviews that I conducted, the one thing that stuck with me is when a lot of professors, they, gave me econometrics textbooks and micro textbooks, and they told me, when I'm trying to teach something, I think of, okay, what is there in this textbook that, the student can't learn when they come to my class, right? So what is the value that I'm adding in this person's education that they can't get straight out of picking up a textbook? And I think that is where this sort of curriculum reform comes in, because there is obviously a very narrow focus on models and theories and the mathematical tools and precision and scientific procedure in economics, but without actually grounding them in society and the things things that are impacted and come from theoretically, it's very difficult for students to relate to anything in the classroom. So firstly, in terms of research impact, what we suggest is actually having an internal departmental review every time a university comes up with a curriculum review to sort of understand how universities are actually engaging with the research that we're conducting, and so it's not in vain. And a related aspect is to have compulsory impact evaluations after every single review is published, maybe 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the line, in order for universities across the UK to sort of understand, okay, this was point A when we published this report. A couple of years down the line, what has changed, and sort of formalize that maybe even in a standardized framework, so we can all compare across universities and maybe countries what has actually come out of this broader movement to reform economics education. And lastly, and I think most importantly, would be student awareness, because the point of education is obviously to make people understand, there are things that you might not know everything of, but at least that these things exist, right? So then you can take the part down. So the most important thing is to make students aware of the fact that there are things that they're not receiving in their education right now, which they have the right to demand. And that is all I have to say about reform.
Thanks, Radhika. Next up, Mads.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So my name is Mads. I'm from Denmark, based in Copenhagen, and I'm part of the Rethinking Economics Denmark. So now we've heard a little bit about these, a few local reviews from Manchester, Durham. So I want to take a step back and talk about the national level. So Denmark is pretty ideal, an ideal place to do that because we only have 4 economics degrees. So it's fairly easy to actually look at all of them together and do a national review. But first, I just want to mention all of the other reviews that have been made across the world. Not all of them, but we're beginning to build this massive body of knowledge that actually documents what is being taught at universities. And we're looking to each other's methodologies for how to do these reviews in order to make them more or less comparative. So we want to have some results from these reviews that can actually be compared across countries as well. So some years ago, there was this international survey done in 7 different countries looking at the composition of modules based mainly on the module names. So fairly and not a very deep review, right? Then we've had countless local reviews, and we've also had national reviews in Germany and France and the Netherlands, the UK that Joe talked about from their book, The Econocracy. And soon we're also getting reviews published in Norway and in Denmark. And actually in Germany, there was even a plan to do like a ranking based on their research, but I don't think it ever actually materialized. But maybe if we get enough comparative results, that's something we can look into. So in Denmark, we wanted to make something that was comparable, as I was into before, and we took basically this Dutch review that they published a book even, so it's very like thorough. And then we took this econocracy methodology, and we look at basically 2 things. We look at the course description, which is publicly available for each econ degree, and in cases of doubt, we went even further into the actual the literature of the course. And then we looked at the exam questions and the written exams in particular, because we wanted to have some quantified measures of these economics degrees that were not like just subjective or our opinions, at least no more than least possible. So in total, we look at 143 courses in these 4 university degrees, which means 4 entire bachelor programs, plus all the possible master's courses and electives in the most populous master's program. And then we categorize each of those modules into one of 7 categories, which are like theoretical modules like macro and microeconomics, for example. There are methodological, such as statistics, mathematics, or econometrics. It's business economics, including finance courses. It's some project modules, history of economics, and then this other category. And our results so far, we're still going through all the results and having students actually verify all the coding is accurate and so on. So these are tentative results. But from our current results, it's basically showing us that theory weighs more than 1/3 of the whole degree. And methodology is around 1/3 as well. Business modules cover 15%. Philosophy of science is only 4%. In some degrees, it's completely absent. History of economics is also mostly absent, but in total covers 3%. And these project modules are around 11%, and then 1% other. So we further categorize each course and go into specifics about which kind of models are actually being taught. Are these like growth models? Are these new Keynesian models? Are these like, what kind of theories are actually being taught here? And when we look at the theoretical modules that I mentioned was around 1/3, then it's fairly evenly split between macroeconomics and microeconomics. And these tend to progress from like a very basic, for example, microeconomics A to microeconomics B to microeconomics C, which starts from this perfect market and then introduces some degree of market failure to make it more complex, but from that frame of reference, right? And we see the same pattern in the macro modules. However, in this theory category, we also had the history of economic ideas, which is completely absent from all the Danish degrees. It's not even an elective module you can take, which is interesting. It used to be, but it disappeared. In the methodological courses, which is also a third, we find that they're mainly quantitative, that is statistics and econometrics. There's partly mathematical courses, and then you have almost zero qualitative methods. So it's not just like research methods in social sciences, but any kind of qualitative methods, understanding surveys or understanding how data is made is absent. And then coming back to the theoretical modules, an interesting finding is that we kind of distinguish between what's neoclassical and what do we, like what's labeled as neoclassical and what do we regard as neoclassical, like where we basically say that this is neoclassical, even though it's not declared as such. So for example, in the most prestigious degree and the most populous as well, it's 97% neoclassical. Out of those 97%, 90% of it is not declared. So this goes back to what Radhika was saying before in their study in Durham as well. Basically, students are not aware that they're being taught a subset of what economics actually is. And there's a whole big discussion about the definition of economics and so on and so forth that I won't go into at all here. And then you might think that if 97% is neoclassical, then the last 3% could be heterodox, right? It could be ecological economics or something about the political economy, but unfortunately it's not. It's actually just behavioral economics, which I would regard as part of this mainstream economics branch. So that means it's 100% mainstream and 97% of it is neoclassical. Yeah, so those are some of the main findings. We also looked at like, is, for example, climate or environmental issues, is it mentioned in these course descriptions at all? So that's like the very least criterion for basically marking that this module has some kind of regard for the environment or the climate. And that's less than 1% of all courses that even mention that issue. The same goes for financial stability or instability. It's less than 1% of all the modules. Then if we skip to the exam part of our research, we look at basically we look at all the written exam sets in the mandatory modules of the bachelor's programs. So there are 81 modules in total in these bachelor's programs. 64 of those are mandatory and 37 of those have written exams that we can actually get and quantify by just categorizing these exam questions. And this follows the methodology from the Econocracy, where we look at how many questions are analytical, meaning that you basically have to, you have some kind of hypothetical question, assume there is a small open economy and so on and so forth. I'm sure most economic students can relate to those questions from written exams. Then you have some descriptive questions, you have some reflexive questions, and then you have multiple choice questions. And in the Econocracy, the average of the 7 universities that were looked into in the UK was that 48% of exam questions were operator model, 24% were descriptive questions, 20% were reflexive, and 8% were multiple choice. And the highest number of operator model questions was at the London School of Economics, where it was 60%. Well, in Denmark, the analytical part or operator model part is 71% of questions. And the reflexive questions only account for 6% of questions compared to 20 in the UK. So you can imagine in Denmark, you're even less expected to think critically about the exam set and about the modules you're taking, at least when you have written exams. So in summary, this also gives us some kind of indication that these economic students are mainly expected to learn a set of ready-made answers to some set of closed questions, which in most cases implies some kind of equation that has to be solved with a fixed answer, right? Then we've been discussing in our group here in Denmark what to do about these issues, right? So economics is being taught as this pure science, inspired by physics, many would say, and where students simply have to learn how to think like an economist and learn how to frame problems in this cost-benefit framework, right? That can be applied to basically anything. So most of the modules use single textbooks, and they often present each theory and model without any critical questions to it. And the most striking thing I would agree with Radhika is that students are not even being told that they're only taught mainstream economics or neoclassical economics. Most students, we did a survey in Aarhus University some years back, where we asked students if they knew what neoclassical even means. And I think more than 90% of the students have no clue what that word means. They've never come across it. These were bachelor students in second and third year. So what can we do to change it? Well, there are many key stakeholders that we want to engage with. And of course, students are campaigning and self-organizing to create our own modules, for example, to have philosophy of science courses and to give that a much bigger place in the economics degrees here in Denmark. Professors can change their own individual modules, but when we have discussions with them, they often say, well, this is my field of research. This is what I know about. I don't know about post-Keynesian economics or these other schools of thought. So I'm not the right person to teach that. I'm just teaching my own module, right? Then you have the deans and the program directors that say, well, it's basically up to the individual professors what they're teaching. We construct the program, but we don't have people who are able to teach history of economics, for example, or history of economic ideas for that matter. And we've even engaged with politicians in Denmark. There was actually a hearing with the Minister of Research and Education, Higher Education, who was of course saying that, well, this is not my job as a politician or a minister to tell these professors what to teach. But of course, you need these, like the basic principles for how higher education functions, right? You need freedom of research. I don't really know how to put that in English, but I hope you know what I mean. And this is a problem because we are dealing with these structures in economics where, for example, the Nobel laureate James Heckman is talking about tribalism in the top 5 journals, that it's basically this self-feeding mechanism or where it's really, really difficult for dissenters or for new thinkers to enter or to penetrate these top journals. So we're discussing a lot like how do we actually work to reform these economics degree and economics as a subject, or are we rather working to build new programs and to move towards some kind of political economy for the 21st century?
Right.
That was my
sweet.
bit.
Thanks, Mads. Peter.
Great, thanks. All right, so I'm Peter. I am in the Durham Society for Economic Pluralism with Radhika. And so far, given all of the presentations that we've gotten from Manchester and from Durham, my job has been to sort of abstract from the particulars and try to provide a sort of perspective of overarching themes that have been running throughout all these. So over the course of our corresponding curriculum reviews, the Pluralist Societies at Durham and Manchester University uncovered various deficiencies, both in the actual economics programs of our respective institutions, as well as in the larger administrative and institutional frameworks within which these programs are taught. Despite having slight differences that are unique to each separate program, we found that the problems exhibited by programs at Durham and Manchester have far more in common than not. So apart from having similar curriculum issues, both institutions noted matching administrative inadequacies in addition to experiencing the common negative effects of certain national policies within the UK. What we've just heard from our colleague in Denmark is a perfect example of the general problems which plague economic scholarship in the UK, as well as being indicative of larger societal issues that influence our field throughout the world. Over the course of my section, I'd like to first highlight the overarching structural problems which Durham, Manchester, and most other universities likely experience. These are not issues of a particular university or even generalizations or a sample of them. Rather, I want them to be problems that I'll describe as inherent to modern economics as a theoretical practice, as well as problems which can be found to affect academia internationally. This will naturally lead to a discussion of the nature of modern economics in itself, which I hope will put the individual reviews which each respective society has carried out into context. The long-term goal, of course, is to recognize the common ills which all of us experience as scholars of economics, and in doing so, deduce informed and accurate prescriptions for future reform. So, of all the pressures which academic institutions around the world face, one which all universities have in common is the need to conform to a certain research and publication orthodoxy. A perfect example of this is the Research Excellence Framework in the United Kingdom. In 1992, the Higher Education Funding Council for England was created to carry out the allocation of funding for research based on 3 points. Those being the volume of research, the subject cost weights, and the quality of the research. The latter was to be based on the assessment first carried out by the research assessment exercise and currently by the Research Excellence Framework every couple of years. The quality of research is assessed on the vitality of research environment, citations, what journals academics publish in, as well as what impact the research has had, with impact being measured by the effect on change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy services, health, environment, or quality of life beyond academia. Now, despite being a well-meaning piece of legislation, REF has created a system of incentives that has thoroughly disrupted the research and teaching that is conducted within universities in the UK. In 2015, an independent review of REF discussed many of the new difficulties that had arisen in the departments of research universities, saying, quote, "The desire to be included in the REF and associated pressures from within the institution could strongly influence academics in their choices about what problems they choose to tackle. This can drive them towards safe topics and short-termism, and a reluctance to engage in risky or multidisciplinary projects in order to ensure reliable, high-quality publications within the REF period, and may be discouraging innovative thinking and risk-taking. This has also led to the exclusion of good research staff who do not fit the HEI selection strategy, potentially demotivating some staff and replacing the completeness of the picture of UK research strength." So what we get from this is that funding from the government is an important income for academic departments. It enables them to hire professors, conduct good quality research, two things which crucially determine what resources there are for different areas to be taught in the economics degree. Therefore, due to the pressure and burden put on academic departments and their respective staff to demonstrate their competence for funding, we understand that there may be reluctance to broaden the scope of teaching, both in terms of time, resource constraints, and incentives. Overall, the REF program creates a system in which existing economics departments are unable to expand into non-mainstream teaching or research for fear of losing or not receiving vital government funding. Many existing research economics programs have been forced to restructure their curriculum and reallocate certain specialists, eliminating any progress towards pluralism which has already been accomplished. Non-mainstream researchers who continue to occupy their academic positions lack the time to engage in teaching, as quotas on research output have become larger than ever. Although reform towards increased pluralism is still possible within the Research Excellence Framework, economics departments throughout the universities of the UK will never have full academic freedom until REF is relaxed or replaced by an alternative evaluative system. This phenomenon is not particular to the UK, though. Many countries whose governments allocate national funding to research employ some type of evaluative scheme to assess the relevance, efficacy, etc. of the work being done. Unfortunately, many of these frameworks employ indicators that are highly reliant on established institutions of research and publication, which are largely left unquestioned by legislators. The use of a journal's impact factor, for example, in assessing a publication's degree of relevance, overlooks the fact that these publications are often led by a certain ideology to the exclusion of high-quality non-mainstream research. A publication's quantity of citations, for example, similarly acts to exclude research that is done by less established individuals or research that doesn't accord with the field's orthodoxy. So overall, I share the same sentiment as Dr. James Galbraith in speaking on this issue. He says that the only way to really evaluate the quality of research is to properly examine it. No shortcut indicators can act as a genuine substitute. The difficulty, of course, is creating a governing body which possesses the relevant knowledge and capabilities to do this. On the other hand, like in Denmark's example, informed government bodies do exist, but still pose significant restrictions to the promotion of pluralism for ideological and political reasons. And that's something that I'll discuss a bit later. An additional challenge facing all of academia is the increasing commercialization and forced expansion of institutions of higher education. Over the past few decades, universities in the United Kingdom have drastically reformulated their priorities and desired long-term outcomes, leading to significant changes in the various structures of the university. An increased emphasis on profit extraction has led to many problems, including the overexpansion of the physical university, an increased impact on the surrounding environment, and worst of all, I would say the casualization of academic positions. This phenomenon of casualization is spurred by the adoption of a short-term academic contract and the diversion of funding away from research and teaching, which does not contribute towards an increase in the university's income, public exposure, etc. The result is that research and teaching conducted in many departments and programs deemed non-essential to the growth of the university are defunded or entirely eliminated. Non-mainstream modules offered by economics departments which aren't a part of the core curriculum are often removed after a short period of time. Academics who teach these modules are often in a particular position for only 9 months at a time, depriving any specific student body of a regularly available diverse curriculum. Those who are fortunate enough to have long-term positions are usually reallocated to do research and teaching which appeals to the majority of the student body. Overall, the instability of academic positions coupled with the reluctance to provide resources to inessential teaching and research has led to a general lack of diversity within economics curriculums. In addition, the accelerated growth of the student body that is observed in conjunction with this kind of university politics leads to an unreasonably large student-to-faculty ratio. The result is that communication between the student body and the faculty or administration becomes increasingly difficult. Many economics faculties fail to communicate to the student body about the various opportunities available within the department. This has been something that both Radhika and Sophia have talked about. Naturally, students then do not engage with certain non-mainstream programs, leading the university to defund or eliminate them. Many economics faculties are keen to develop pluralistic content. However, the lack of student engagement with the faculty prevents certain demands from becoming known to leaders within the university. An enlargement of the university's student body often leads to an expansion of its administrative bureaucracy. This creates similar communicative problems between faculty and university bureaucrats. Faculty members are often ready to implement change within their departments, but administrators are either unavailable or reluctant to engage with academics. These administrators are often non-academics and are unable to fully relate to the desires of the faculty or student body. But I would say that in an age of accelerating globalization and commercialization, it's inevitable that institutions of higher education, as we know them, will likely cease to exist. But this does not necessarily have to be a negative thing. The goal should be to utilize the technological and organizational benefits that come with such modern movements, whilst combating certain forces which lead to universities to betray the fundamental aspects that make them what they are. And so, in my last overarching issue, I want to highlight the prevalence of ideology within economics education as in general. This theme has been running throughout my previous 2 points, but it's worth highlighting on its own as well. Economics is a deeply ideological practice. Despite being a fairly systematized scientific area of inquiry, it's essentially based on certain philosophical and political presuppositions. The nature of economics has led to certain schools of thought within the field dominating over others. Obviously, the classical examples that we've talked about being the neoclassical Keynesian variety. Academics inevitably subscribe to some particular economic orientation, often resulting in entire faculties or departments preferring one method over the other. Thus, even when the student body and administration of a university are cooperative, certain key faculty members which shape economics curriculum may deem heterodox or non-mainstream programs unnecessary. This phenomenon was noticeably highlighted in Manchester University's findings, as we've heard. In this instance, large-scale student organization and thorough vertical communication throughout the university are essential to overcome the reluctance of faculty members in amending or augmenting economics curriculum. This sort of intellectual prejudice also exists among the individuals who occupy positions in government, as I've mentioned. Denmark's federal government empowers a group of representatives from each of its economics faculties in creating guidelines for research evaluation. However, these economists represent a largely neoclassical echo chamber, which prevents groundbreaking research from achieving recognition as it used to before. So overall, all of these points lead us back to the classical ideological struggle within economics and most other social sciences. And that's what I have to say on that point. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everyone for presenting. So we've actually ran over time, so we could probably squeeze a few questions. So We had a question by Eric Decker. So for the student groups, for the groups who did the research, how did you classify the different syntheses such as behavioral economics and neoclassical overlap? So how did you like separate them? Like, because there's a lot of overlapping. How did you tackle that? Sophia, would you like to answer that? Because you did. You know.
Yeah, sure. So we tended to separate neoclassical and behavioral economics when we were assessing, let's say, module review, while still recognizing that there is still a lot of overlap between the two. So we tend to be more generous with the definition of behavioral economics, so saying that it can be recognized as a separate school of thought. In student survey, I don't think there was actually any questions that was asking specifically about behavioral economics or neoclassical economics. Again, alternative schools of thought being, we considered, let's say, Marxist school of thought or new institutional, ecological, environmental to be something separate. So something alternative and heterodox.
We have another question by Leah Quadros Flores. So this is for the whole panel. What is your opinion on the core curriculum? Would it improve awareness to both pluralism and lack of empirical foundations to economic models? If so, how is it getting so much resistance from universities? Did professors really believe that neoclassical is superior to all others, or is it more about its simplicity and objectivity as opposed to realism and applicability? Mads, would you like to answer this?
Yeah, I was actually gonna. I think Joe might be the best person to answer about the core curriculum, because I think he's actually looked more into it than I have. Maybe I'm wrong, Joe.
Right.
Your microphone is muted.
Yeah, I've just been sorting. Can you hear me? Good. I've just been sorting out my headset, so hopefully the sound is better. The problem is I missed you reading that out, so I mean, is it a question about, I can talk all day about the core curriculum? is that yeah, opinion on core curriculum? Yes, yeah, and I did catch some of it. Yeah. Oh, well, why is it not spreading? My understanding is it's spread quite far. Professor's resistance. Okay, I'm getting some more feedback. So so I guess I will just speak very briefly. As it was mentioned in that talk, I think it's an improvement. I think that it's not pluralist. I think that for me, the question about core is it a bridge to further reform? If it is, great. I wholeheartedly support it. Is it or is it a way to say we've changed? We don't need any further reform. I don't know the latest figures on where it has spread. My understanding is that it's spread pretty extensively across the US and across the UK. And then I think less, but to an extent in other European countries. I think the reason it's spread is because it does pose this quite useful way of demonstrating reform, either in answers to student or other pressure. I guess the reason it hasn't spread further is for the reasons that the reform that we're trying to push is challenging, professors' resistance, institutional resistance, general inertia in the kind of culture of economics and the structures which maintain the status quo. Hope that helped.
Right. Thanks, Joe. So it's now, so sorry if we couldn't answer some of your questions from Q&A. So now it's time for the academics panel. Please welcome Dr. Guizzo, Dr. Mearman, and Joe for this section. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you guys for the presentations. That was really interesting. Also, thank you for the invite. I'm glad to be part of this discussion. You can all hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So I'll keep my points brief because I know we're a bit short on time. So yeah, it's great to be part of this discussion. I remember when the post-crash and the Rethinking Economics, they were the predecessors of the student movement and how it led at least to some discussion on economics education and some push for change, which I think is great. However, part of why we're having this discussion now is to show that actually this hasn't changed that much, right? It's still far from ideal. So I think that some of the examples that we picked up from Sophia, from Radhika, from Peter, and from Mads show that there's still so much that we can go and so much change that we can still do. Of course, this brings a lot of points. I mean, there were so many interesting things that came up from the discussion. So I'll just pick up a few points. The first one that I couldn't ignore, I have to say. I know we're bringing 3 examples, at least 2 examples from the UK and 1 from Denmark. However, looking at the discussion, the Q&A boxes and the list of attendees, I cannot help but to see how many people we've got that are not from Europe. So we have a lot of names from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. And I think this really shows that what happens in economics education in the UK also spreads out. So we have, I like to use the core periphery metaphor here on how we're teaching, at least economics education in the UK, the Anglo-US system still very much dominates on what happens in economics education elsewhere in other contexts, especially in the global South. So I think this shows how much what we do here in the UK serves as an example, whether that's good or bad, serves as an example for other countries and for other curriculum frameworks. So I think that we need to keep that in mind for the discussion. And so a few comments that I'd like to pick up here that came from the discussion. So first, of course, the issue of power. So we're discussing some attempt to make change, and I know that some marginal changes were achieved from the post-crash and from the Durham Society. But still, when we discuss economics education in the UK, still is a reflection of the UK higher education system, which is very hierarchical and very, you know, stratified into the top departments and what the top departments do and want, and the herd behavior of what the others will do to follow the top departments. So when we think about Cambridge, Oxford, LSE, UCL, and St. Andrews, what they do, most departments will try to follow a similar framework. So we have to bear that in mind. So top departments and power here matters a lot. And second is what the universities are saying to respond to these changes, but also what universities say that they offer this sort of curriculum and they offer this sort of economics education because of the demands for economists in the labor market, or because they want employability levels to be very high. So I think that we also need to think about, I think it was in 2013 or 14 that there was the employers survey from the Economics Network that showed that actually employers want not necessarily a mainstream curriculum. Employers don't want necessarily just in your classical framework. Employers want something closer of what we can think about as a pluralist curriculum. At least some acknowledgement of, you know, uncertainty, bounded rationality, the limitations of the market, collective behavior, etc. So I think this could be potentially a good point to be picked up on how we can pressure for change in terms of making universities or at least departments to change the curriculum as well. We know that if they emphasize so much employability and value for money, because education in this country is paid. So this is something that we can think about. So how we can push for this employability element, and this diversity and this pluralism is something that it's wanted from the economists that we are forming. So a few other points that I picked up here, and then I'll promise I'll shut up. So first one is how we can think about teaching training. So this is something that it's becoming quite standard, or at least a requirement for most young lecturers that start a job here in the UK. Basically for lecturers to have a take on educational philosophy and think about assessments and best way of delivery, etc. But maybe can we think about an education teaching training, an economics education teaching training, on how economists, once they start their trajectory in teaching in a university, how can they get in touch with other theories, with other frameworks, which maybe they don't even know. And that goes to my second point. So when we discuss things about pluralism and diversity, I have the feeling that we need to produce more guidelines as well, and what we mean by that and how we do it. Because I have the feeling that some economists and some departments, they have no clue of what that is. What is pluralism? What is diversity? What is decolonizing? I think that some of them, they haven't got a clue of how to do it. What do we mean by that? And how do we implement that in teaching? So maybe, and this is open for discussion, of course, how we can produce that, how to guidelines, how to document, to show how this is possible and it can be implemented. Finally, my last point was about the guidelines. So I was quite pleased with some of the points that Mads brought from the example in Denmark, about having a national body that oversees the curriculum frameworks in Denmark. Of course, we know that not necessarily this means more pluralism, but if we can think about something, a similar example maybe for the UK, would this be the case? I mean, we have the QAA now, but we know that that's very limited in comparison to what it can do. So maybe we can think about guidelines of our curriculum or for curriculum frameworks on how we can tick boxes, not just about technical teaching, so things that we expect economists to have in the end, but also the basic principles of citizenship, of knowledge, of pluralism and diversity as well. So here is, I think, where the UK can learn more from other examples instead of teaching others how to do it. So if we take curricular examples from even maybe Denmark, looks like a better example from what we have now, looks more, yeah, Matt's face, yeah, a little bit. So even some examples, I mean, I am very aware of what happens in Latin America, for instance. So some curricular frameworks, and in Brazil and Argentina, even in Mexico, they can serve as an example for us. I am aware of some examples in Africa as well. So how can we incorporate that into our teaching and maybe bring on the guidelines that I was talking about? So I think that's enough for me for now, but happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guizzo. We have Dr. Mearman next. Thanks.
Hi, everybody, and like Danny, I'm very grateful to be here. This is a great event, and it's an excellent group, and you've been doing brilliant things in your work for many years, including the Econocracy book, which is fantastic, not to embarrass anybody on here, but it really is definitely worth a read if you haven't read it, although of course you have. I knew it was a risk of going after Danny because I knew she was going to say lots of things I was going to say, so she has. So now I'm scrambling for new points. I think the one thing we haven't mentioned yet, but it's crucial, is teaching excellence framework. This is something that hasn't been mentioned yet. It's the teaching, well, maybe not equivalent, let's hope not, of the research excellence framework. And it's not actually run yet in an official way. It's only run as a pilot. But that does have some sort of potential, again, for promoting student voice and student power, because whatever we think of it, higher education is more of a market, and consumers have power, or they have some power, and it's important to use that power. I think that one of the important things about this group is that that's exactly what it's doing, and the research you're doing is also part of that voice. And it's really great to see that you're doing the research really well, and that is important, because it's very easy for your work to be dismissed, and that's something you have to be aware of. And I think also, and again, if these comments appear to be condescending, they're not meant to be at all. It's really important that you can show very clearly a good understanding of what's going on. Now, you understand the structural problems, you understand how ref works, you understand how hiring works, because that is what your departments will respond to you. That's what they'll say, and they'll be genuine in that. Most people aren't out to give you a bad time or a bad education or anything like that. They're genuine in their efforts to do better, and there are structural constraints, and there are limits on what they've been trained to do, which will mean that they can't do certain things that they might want to do. So these are real constraints, and it's sort of trying to work with them as far as they can, as far as you can. There are so many things I could say, and there are loads of brilliant questions as well. And so I'm just going to sort of go off, pick on a couple of things that, well, one thing that was said and one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet. And I'm amazed it hasn't been mentioned, because I thought Joe was going to talk about it when he talked about the spread of something across America. I thought, oh, he's talking about that, but he didn't mention it. The one thing I was going to say is about thinking like an economist. What does that mean? This is often used as a reason why you can't be pluralist, but actually it's not. It's a reason to just think, well, rethink, what does that mean? What does thinking like an economist mean? And in terms of employability of economists, there's no evidence at all that if you're a heterodox or pluralist economist, you're less employable. You might be less employable in certain, getting a job at a Russell Group university teaching, but there's no evidence that you're any less employable as a government economist, or somebody working for a bank, or somebody working in many different areas. In fact, there is a little bit of evidence from Australia. Somebody called Rod O'Donnell published a paper showing some evidence that actually pluralist training and heterodox training was better for employability. And you can think of reasons why that might be the case, in terms of being able to think more flexibly, being able to think more about real world issues than being focused on a particular training program. And in terms of employability, if that's the objective of the program, and that's an if that is the objective of the program, you can actually make quite a strong case for pluralism, for heterodoxy. You don't need to be taught the entire canon of neoclassical economics to get an undergraduate degree in economics. If you want to go on and do a PhD in neoclassical economics, then you do. But to get a job and to have a good training in economics, you don't need to do that entire canon. You can have a broader perspective. The one last thing I was going to say, and this is the thing you haven't mentioned, it's COVID. Now you don't want to talk about it, but it's actually quite interesting. I'm not trying to cause trouble for any other departments, because I'm sure this would cause trouble in my department as well. But if you said, give us a course on COVID, what would they say? And the reason I raise this is because COVID raises so many interesting questions for economists and how you arrange an economics course. So, for instance, the idea of a key worker, what does that mean? Why is it key? What makes it key? It's some sort of valuation of that's key. And then you look at the category of key workers and you look at how well they're paid, and you see that actually some of them have not paid very much at all. So their exchange value is very low, but their use value is very high. Now that's a fundamental question about economics. And going back through the history of economics, value is one of the most fundamental questions. And here in the middle of this crisis, we've got this notion of key worker or key sector or whatever, which is crying out for some economics, but not just about utility or subjective well-being or mainstream measures of these things. It calls for a wider discussion. And if you want to go even further into the COVID example, you know, the widespread support, the huge amounts of money being spent by governments, again, that suggests that they value certain things more than others. But then the questions are about how do they deal with that? If they go into large amounts of debt, does that matter? How do they repay the debt if they even need to? Could they print money to do it? What are the implications of that? These are all huge, big questions that are being asked now that can't really be answered through looking at one perspective in economics. To answer them adequately, you'd need to look at least two, possibly more. Now, how you do that is not easy, which is why you're not going to get a course next week in it. But it's an interesting provocation, and it's an interesting example of how you could redesign programs to deal with concrete issues which require you to be more pluralist, more open, and deal with real things. And you know, I'll say one last thing. Core has many limitations, but one of the things it does try to do is get students to engage with real world examples and real things and big questions. And we don't know yet whether that's going to manifest in changes higher up the degree structure. It's too early to say, but there is a potential there. And I think that you can engage with your more skeptical teachers by saying, look, we just want to learn about real things, and here's an example of how you could do it, and here's a real question you could ask. So I shall stop there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mearman. Next, we have Joe.
How much time do we have until we're scheduled to finish? 3 minutes, is that right?
Yeah, for this segment, there's 3 minutes left.
I'll do 3 minutes. I guess, you know, to tail this off maybe, I just feel like with the, you know, 100 or so people here in this virtual room, you know, just hearing what's been said, all of the real hard work that's gone into the, and talent that's gone into the research, developing the arguments, and seeing all the 36 points in the Q&A that we've not answered and in the chat box, it just feels like the knowledge is there, and the base, I guess, is there, and it feels like with COVID, which hadn't been mentioned until Andrew raised it, the time is there, and yeah, I guess it feels like movements kind of go in waves of, you know, we had a point where it kind of flared up, and there was lots of coverage and groups set up, but then there's been a really, really important phase of digging in and of entrenching and of institutionalizing, because I guess that, yeah, there have been student movements in the past, and the challenge is that they haven't been able to carry on long enough to outlast the academics and the institutions who have said that they would put it into a review in a few years' time and see what happened. So yeah, I guess it just feels like there always will be really interesting and difficult questions of strategy and tactics. Mads earlier mentioned that kind of challenge of, do you go for reforming economics and the long march through the institutions, or do you try to build alternative structures? Do you do political economy for the 21st century? And, you know, again, I think looking at the past and learning from the experience of people in Australia who set up political economy departments, my view is the answer has to be both. You can't leave economics how it is, because it does have this strength, this credibility in broader society, but at the same time, alternatives will help show that economics needs to change to remain relevant and and to become fit for purpose. So yeah, I would just really, you know, urge and support all of this group and the others out there to kind of keep pushing on. And I feel like there is a point now in which we can try to build that momentum, and yeah, really across all of the countries, amazed by how many yeah, how many people we've got here from across the world. Shouldn't be really, but still it's lovely to be here. So anyway, that's 3 minutes.
Thanks very much, Dr. Guizzo, Dr. Mearman, and Joe for speaking. So now we've got 10 minutes of question, but I would like to start off by just asking around COVID. So Dr. Mearman, you mentioned, you know, the presence of COVID is gonna make people, you know, there is a need to think of problems from different perspectives. And so do you think in the coming year or years, there will be economics departments at universities or like across the world in Denmark? Do you think they'd be more responsive to our campaigns and our demands for more pluralistic curriculum?
Nice, easy question. I mean, on COVID itself, there's lots of work being done on that, and university departments across the world in all kinds of disciplines have been asked to do research on it and make bids for that. So it is clearly not just for everyday reasons, but for professional reasons, also something that they're really working on. So there's no shortage of material there for people to draw on. So you can certainly, as an entry point into getting some change and getting some new courses, it's definitely one that's useful and has potential. Will there be greater pluralism? As we've discussed, there's a huge amount of structural barriers to that. On the other hand, pluralism is something that people don't tend to object to. It's seen as a sort of friendly thing. Danielle and I have been looking at the notion of heterodox economics, and that's quite different. That's seen as being something a lot more confrontational or oppositional, whereas pluralism is seen as something that we can all get behind. In fact, many mainstream economists think of themselves as pluralists. So I think it's just about using the opportunities that are there, and using the doors that are slightly open to sort of try and push through even further. So I'm not going to make a prediction about whether departments are going to get more pluralist, because that's, you know, I'd be fool. But you know, there is scope for that. There is potential for that. You just have to try to be clever and you press the right buttons.
I just add something there. I agree with what Andrew said. I would just add that, yes, I think the current moment says that economics is under pressure. Many departments are under pressure to show how the current tools can help to understand the current COVID crisis. But we cannot just be, I don't want to be very pessimistic, but we cannot just assume that this is another 2008 moment and assume that everything will change and response will come and change will come very spontaneously. We might fall into the danger that this won't happen. So I think that this shows that we need to learn from what happened in 2008. Some change has happened, of course, but we need to push for more. And I think this is why it's very important for us to go to two channels. First, the students' pressure. I think what you guys are doing is crucial to try and make some change in the economics education. And secondly, which is something that, like Joe's working, for instance, is the view of the general public. I think once we have public demand for different economists, this may drive to some change.
Can I just make a comment here? I'll try to be brief. I wanna just comment on that I think in general the Rethinking Economics movement is also branching into both engaging with students through all of our local groups, and then one of the reasons we set up a national chapter in Denmark is exactly because we also want to reach out to the broader public. I think it's being done in many countries now, but in Denmark, just to mention an example, we did a radio program in public national radio where we actually, for example, talked about the COVID-19 and how we value workers and how we pay nurses, for example, and is that fair, is it not fair, and that whole discussion that's not really being taken within economics departments. And then going back to a comment you made earlier, just very, very brief, Danielle, you mentioned that these pluralist degrees in Latin America in particular, in the global south, and it's interesting, you mentioned exactly Argentina and Brazil, where we also find that their degrees, many of them are much more pluralist than what they are in the global north. However, we had a group in Peru, for example, that was trying to campaign, and they were trying to engage the students and have more people join in. But the students cared more about this accreditation scheme from the US that the university was trying to achieve. And therefore, this degree was becoming more mainstream. It was becoming more quantitative methods and so on, and moving in exactly the opposite direction. So that's why we're trying to identify these structures, like these accreditation schemes, these funding structures, hiring structures, and so on. Like, we have to address those both at a national and international level in order to be successful at the local level.
We just wrote a paper about that, about Brazil. So we could share the details of that. It's in the Review of International Political Economy. And yeah, it says exactly that.
Thanks. Do any other of the groups have any comments they want to make about what the academics suggested? Great. So we have a few minutes left, but I just want to ask this question kind of on behalf of some of the student groups. So seeing that, let's say Post-Crash that did a report in 2014, and recently we finishing the report, and we're still seeing the same issues, and progress hasn't really been very substantial. What would your advice be for student groups at universities to kind of make a more impactful campaign, especially when, next year lectures and tutorials are going to be online? This is open up to the whole panel.
My first thing is, I guess, maybe not, or be careful. I guess I think be careful of the assumption. Well, I guess it's how does change happen? And my view, you see these big changes and tipping points, and if we get to a big, tipping point in economics, it will, from looking from the outside, it will look like it just happened. But all of this organizing work and this research. So I think we're not in the, post-crash, and we're not in the same place that we were in 2014. And that's thanks to, the organizing that everyone here and Rethinking and across the world have done, and all of the academics who are working on this as individuals and networks. And also really importantly, I think, there are the kind of global foundations too who are supporting this, so kind of environmental groups and funders who recognize that you have to change economics and how we think about the economy to have a hope of having a sustainable future. So there is a real, so much has gone into building a real broad coalition. So I guess that's I think the idea behind this thing of saying, it feels like we're maybe at the same place. There's another crisis there was in 2008. We're trying to respond to it, but we're not. And I think the foundations and the alliances are much stronger now. But of course, we can't, as Danielle says, assume that change is going to happen, because that would be stupid. And so the answer is always through really good organizing and campaigning and influencing. It's through using the research and communicating it effectively and building across students. And I think it's really hard, because I guess there's a real, it's a hard thing to do, to put yourself out there, I think, and go and try and convince a lecture hall full of your peers that, they need to support this change. And I guess, so I think, it comes back down to the really clever and well thought out campaigning and influencing. and doing it together, and sharing what learns into sharing what works internationally too.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can add to that at all, whether I even need to. You keep going. That's the thing. I mean, change doesn't happen overnight. Things are changing. There are still potentials for things to change more. Economics remains under pressure as a discipline. You know, the concerns that you've expressed are not just expressed by you; they're expressed much more generally, and they have been for some time. And you know, if you look at organisations like the Bank of England and other places like that, they've changed quite a bit what they do and what they say and how they think, and that's indicative of the potential for further change. So don't be discouraged.
So I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you everyone for speaking. Thank you for the student groups and the academics for getting involved and sharing your opinions. Thanks Ross for the tech support, and thanks everyone for tuning into the session. Have a great time for the rest of the festival.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye all.
Bye, guys.
It's the awkward end of a Zoom event.
Bye all.
Bye.
Right. Bye.
Keep going. Lovely to meet you all digitally. Bye.